we can go ahead and start. I'm going to introduce Chris, who is one of our beloved faculty here at UNC, is a UNC alum, teaches over 1,000 students every fall in Comp 110, went on to do his graduate work at Brown and has industry and academia experience, so that he would be the best person to kind of moderate this. So thank you so much, Chris. And I'm going to sign out of here.
Great, thanks, Rosario. And we've got a fantastic panel today. I think the best way of being sure everyone's able to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background is just to go around the group. And I think we started in alphabetical order with the last group, so we'll do that again here. Colin, if you want to kick us off.
Sure, yeah. My name is Colin Raffle. Thanks a lot for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm currently a new assistant professor at UNC in computer science. I do research mainly on machine learning, and I spent the past 4 years as a research scientist at Google Brain, which is a large industrial lab that does machine learning research. And I'm currently still a research scientist at Google Brain 20% of my time. So I spend basically 1 day a week with a Google hat on and 4 days a week with my UNC hat on.
Great. And Cynthia, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Stern. I'm an associate professor at UNC. My research is in hardware security using formal methods to prove the security of systems or find flaws in systems. Before coming to UNC, I did my graduate work at UC Berkeley, and before that, I did my undergrad at ASU. And I really just have been in academia the whole way through. Outside of, I did a brief stint in industry between undergrad and grad school, and then I did internships while I was in grad school. But otherwise, I've been in academia the whole way through.
All right, thanks. And Jeff, go ahead.
Hey everybody, Jeff Terrell. I got my PhD from UNC's Computer Science Department in 2009, coming from Arkansas. Since then, I tried to commercialize my PhD research. Got a lot of experience as an entrepreneur. Never quite got our feet under us in terms of revenue and all that good stuff. So ended up going onto a software consulting firm local to the area in Holly Springs. And I've been at UNC as professor of the practice in computer science. This is my 3rd year now. So I've kind of been in industry, been in academia, kind of back and forth a little bit.
Great, thanks. And Lori, if you'll go ahead.
I see I'm muted. Lori Williams, professor at NC State in computer science, primarily working in software security, but also software process like agile and continuous deployment. So I have a PhD in computer science, an MBA from Duke, and a bachelor's in industrial engineering. So I've, been around the block as far as different degrees. And I worked at IBM for 9 years after my bachelor's and while I got my master's. So I do have both academic and industry experience. Been at NC State 20 years, long time. And sorry it's so dark. I guess this room is not great for Zoom at night.
No worries, thanks. And last, I want to be sure I get your name right. Is it Lina or Lena?
Lena.
Lena. Okay, great, thank you.
So actually, hi, Lori. We started at the same time 20 years ago. I was like,
except she was a PhD student and I was a professor.
I was like your TA, right? That's how I started
my very first
PhD.
TA.
Yeah. So anyways, I've been in and out of NC State for the last 20 years. I came in as at the time in the early 2000s, computer networking was a big thing. So they had started this program. So I came in and my idea was to just get that and then go into industry. But my plans kept on changing. So as I was finishing up, I transitioned into a PhD and I worked in the area of queuing theory and network performance area. And when I graduated again, didn't know what I'm going to do. And I ended up working in industry for about 7 years. Lastly at IBM research, again, in the area of performance, mostly in networking and grid computing, cloud computing, and so on. And then for the last 8 years, I came back to state and as a teaching professor. And I'm currently a teaching associate professor at State.
Great, thank you. So we've got a lot of varied experience here. And one of the first questions that came in from students who had joined as part of the registration process, these questions came in. We've got, all of us are professors here. And so one of the questions to just get out of the way is grad school only for professors? And Lori, I might turn this one over to you since you've been out at IBM and at other places, and maybe you can address this one.
Yeah, I mean, so grad school is master's and PhD. So if you're going for a master's, then you're not going to be a professor typically. I mean, people can teach with masters, but it's not a very lucrative career, I'd say, if you're to teach with the master's degree. And so like masters are for people who want to go in industry and to have more specialized skills. And then PhD lots of people probably, you know, some larger percent, Leslie, you may know the answer, 60%, 70% of our PhD students probably still go to industry and 30% in academia. Leslie, do you know the answer to that?
For PhDs, yes, about 2/3 go into industry and 1/3 roughly in academia.
Right, right. So, and then, you know, like you heard some people here who had a PhD and went to industry, like you can get really, really interesting assignments in industry with the PhD. So PhD program, you know, is both, where master's is really industry.
Sure. And I think one of the other things that's worth distinguishing, because this is something I didn't really know much about, is there's not just one kind of master's. There are programs that have certificates and professional masters. Does anyone here want to give an explanation of the difference between, say, a professional master's and a master's degree?
I mean, I guess I'll continue since someone
Go for
jumped in. So a professional master's are fully classes. You just take classes and you finish. And then a regular master's degree, a master of science, is a thesis. And that's a good option to take if you're not quite sure if someday you want to get into research. And, you know, and so it gives you a taste of what research is like. And then, you know, you go away with a master's degree and may never come back, or you may actually be convinced that, hey, that's pretty cool.
Great.
And go on to get a PhD, I guess is the rest.
Yeah. And I think in the previous panel, I think there was a good discussion of the process of getting a PhD getting a master's en route to the PhD. That was one of the questions that came up, and some of the funding models. And so I think there's some valuable content there. I think one of the common questions that also came up from students that I'm going to twist it just a little bit and try and probe some of the interesting experiences you all have had. I think sometimes you feel like you've learned a lot in your undergraduate career. Like, what more really is there to learn after completing your bachelor's of science in computer science, or your bachelor of arts in computer science? And so I wonder if, and I think there's not a lot of certainty on some of the kinds of things that people research. I know that you all mentioned some of the broader areas that you're in, but I'm wondering if we could go around and just share some project that you have recently worked on in your history that you wouldn't have been prepared to be able to work on if you had just completed your undergraduate degree, something that has been a result of moving through a graduate program and going deeper. And like, what did that work actually look like? And this is trying to get to the point of, I think a lot of people have a difficulty imagining what careers as professors or as research scientists and so on actually look like in academia versus industry. So I might start with you, Colin, because you've got the interesting assignment at Google Brain.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's an interesting question. I think I'll use as an example the first paper that I wrote after I finished my PhD. This was when I was at Google Brain. And the skills that I like to think that you get over the course of your PhD that you don't have, or you might not get as much during the undergrad, basically all revolve around being able to scope and complete a research project that culminates in a publication. And so this is things like deciding what you're going to work on, what problems are good problems to work on, what experiments you need to run, actually running the experiments, what to do when the experiments don't work out the way you want them to, like what to pivot, how to pivot your research direction so that you actually have something publishable at the end of it, writing up the results, revising them, presenting them, making graphs. All of these things are things that I may have learned kind of a little bit of during undergrad through kind of course projects and assignments. But over the course of, a 4 or 5 year PhD, you're forced to go through this process multiple times. And really by the end of it, you hopefully have a pretty decent mastery of it. And so for this first paper at Google Brain, with almost no supervision, I was able to take a, preliminary project idea, try it out, figure out why it didn't work, change it, try it again until it finally worked, submit it for publication, do the whole process basically on my own, which I certainly wouldn't have been able to do right out of undergrad. And like I said, there are many, many skills involved there. And I think in the best case, at the end of your PhD, you have a decent mastery of all of those skills.
Cynthia, can you talk a bit about a research project that you've been on that has been enabled by graduate studies and further studies in your field?
Yeah, and I agree with what Colin was saying about it's these skills around how to do research are really what you get, or what I got out of grad school, and also, coming out of undergrad, I felt like I certainly understood the material that I learned in undergrad, right? I did well in undergrad and I felt like I really understood those courses. But the other thing that happens in grad school is you do just dig into course material more deeply, and you, or at least I, dug into new topics that I hadn't covered in undergrad, because undergrad is only 4 years and there's only so much you can do in 4 years. So in addition to these skills of sort of how to do research, I think one of the areas that I really didn't have really any knowledge of coming out of undergrad, maybe just, I had taken the required languages course, but formal methods and formal thinking, which I use a lot in my research, and I really developed sort of mastery of that content in grad school. And I'll say that the way that you develop that mastery is different in grad school than in undergrad, right? It's not through taking a course, although that is part of it, but that's never, or at least for me, that was not sufficient, right? You find the courses that will be helpful to your research, but there's also just a lot of reading of papers that you have to do, and also just doing your research, you'll learn as you go, right? And so, so for me, the content that I learned in my graduate work that I now use in my research is the use of formal methods, formal verification methods. But another skill that I also used was kind of how to learn outside of the very nicely structured classroom with a beautiful textbook that has been edited, and you have assignments that there's a solution to the assignment, right? And you don't have any of that necessarily when you're learning this material on your own in grad school. And so that was another skill that I developed in grad school.
Great, thanks. I'm going to keep going around. And Lena, do you want to give any response on this topic?
Yeah, I kind of absolutely agree that those are the skills, right? Like sometimes people have a little bit of kind of misconception of what a PhD is. You don't get much smarter or anything. I don't think it's what you're really doing is you're preparing yourself to be a computer science researcher, right? You're learning all the skills on how to do research, something that, some people get exposed to maybe during their undergrad. But you have to be okay with not knowing what the answer is, right? That's one thing that's uncomfortable. That's why it's called research. And unlike in undergrad, where a lot of things are, you may take some topics that are kind of edge cutting or some novel things. It's not until grad school that you actually dive into it, and kind of could be at the front end of developing things that nobody else has thought of before, right? But with that also is also kind of like the process of highs and lows, right? Sometimes, you have that third-year PhD where you're like, oh, I can't work on this anymore. And, and then maybe you come up with something. So it's, you have to be comfortable with the unknown. And that's, I think, the biggest difference of how an undergrad is kind of a preparation to just be prepared. And then it's a graduate school that you could actually be more independent and kind of pick the things you want to spend more time learning about. Yeah.
Thanks. And Jeff, I'm going to come to you and maybe tweak this just a little bit. We've been hearing a lot about learning how to do research. And I think in some undergraduate courses, you get research opportunities. But when you get to a PhD program, research is an activity that you do and is something that feels kind of nebulous from the perspective of many undergraduate students. And so I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to, like, what does research actually look like in your experience doing networking research, and how did that sort of, some of the skills that you developed translate to doing a startup, which is different from, I think, many of the other industry experiences on the panel?
Great, yeah, I'd be happy to attempt to answer that. Day to day, I think it depends a fair bit on kind of how far along you are into the program, but at least for me, initially, I would say the entire first year of my PhD work, I came to UNC in 2004. I got my master's en route to my PhD, got out in 5 years. My first year was just learning things, trying things out. And I eventually came up with a negative result, actually. We were trying to apply a certain kind of analysis technique to a certain kind of networking data to try to do something. And I found out eventually I got enough understanding about how the analysis technique worked that I could definitively say this isn't going to work, which is interesting, right? Like, I came in as a grad student, and that's kind of a flavor of what you get. I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but just like, my professors didn't know. I had to go and figure this stuff out to answer this question. And so a lot of this is, you got to figure out your own way to do things. As I got farther along in the PhD, working towards the dissertation and graduating, there was a lot more sort of, I'm not taking classes at this point. I'm just heads down on my research. I really, to be honest, I hated that season of life. It was not fun. Writing the dissertation, I felt like, your experience may vary. Maybe many people on the panel would say they did a much better job at this than I did. But my experience was force myself out of bed just in time to catch the bus and get in the parking lot before all the spots were taken, the park and ride lot, slack off all day, figure out anything I could do besides actually write and work on the research. And then eventually, like 5 p.m., get a little bit of writing in. And maybe I would get in a flow and work until the last bus at like 10 p.m. or something like that. But it was a terrible life. I hated that season. And maybe that's an indication that research isn't for me. And I actually don't do research in my role as professor of the practice, not that kind of research. But that was kind of a day-to-day flavor of it. And it was a mix between, like, so I wrote a lot of scripts. My PhD was, I collected 4 terabytes plus of networking data and did a lot of analysis on that. I had to write the tool that would actually go and collect the data. It was a lot of kind of low-level programming and very careful reverse engineering of TCP, a lot of edge cases to consider. Collected all the data. I did a whole bunch of analysis of it. And that was my day-to-day, was basically looking at the latest results, tweaking my scripts, automating everything, and then eventually writing and just trying to write and get stuff out there. And eventually I was done. I don't quite know how that happened, but eventually I was done. So as far as translating into entrepreneurship and trying to commercialize that research, whole different world, really was. I mean, there was still a lot of skills that translate. One of the things that you get out of a PhD a lot of times is you get real good at writing. Your writing skills, like, you don't even realize how bad you are at writing until you get through your PhD and look at your old writing, and you're like, I thought I was a good writer. That was terrible. And you learn as you go. You read some of these academic papers and realize how concise you can make things and how crisp, the writing can be or whatever. But so some of those things are actually useful in entrepreneurship, but a lot of stuff is really just kind of a different world. And so I took a crash course in entrepreneurship. I never intended to be an entrepreneur. That was never my life's ambition. I always wanted to be a professor. So it was a bit of a curveball for me to find myself in this position where here I am trying to commercialize this research. There's still a lot of, the fact that you're on your own, trying to make your own way. I would say grad school was a very good preparation for me in that regard, because entrepreneurship is, I would say, even more that way. In grad school, you at least have your advisor to say, okay, why don't you try looking at this problem? Or I see you're stuck, let's talk about this, or whatever. Entrepreneurship, it's more like, I don't know. I don't even know what I don't know. I have to go figure this out. So yeah, there you go.
Great. Yeah, in my experience, I think one of the key differences in entrepreneurship is exactly what you had mentioned. It's kind of disarming not to have someone who's a mentor or a boss, and that's a difficult thing to navigate. Lori, I want to turn it over to you, and we've now heard a little bit about what the PhD process looks like, and I think we'll come back to talking a little bit more about industry in just a moment. Students have a good sense of what the activities of teaching look like because they're on the other side of it almost at all times. But you've been through, you're now a distinguished professor at NC State. You've been through the tenure process and have successfully navigated that dimension of academia. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what, as a professor, your role looks like outside of teaching, and maybe what does it look like to work on, you know, a research project and a paper with somebody?
Sure. So one thing I'll mention before I get into that, which relates to the earlier question, and really what Lena said, and because it might resonate with someone. When I worked at IBM, and I left IBM to get a PhD, but when I was trying to decide whether to do it or not, I happened to be at a family gathering, and there was someone there who I never saw again, but he was an accountant. And somehow I was explaining to him, like, I think maybe I'm going to get a PhD because I think I want to teach in college, but I don't think I'm smart enough. And he said, I'm an accountant and I do taxes for all kinds of people, including professors and people with PhDs, and they're no smarter than anybody else. He said, the only thing that they have is persistence. And if you have persistence, you can get a PhD. And, you know, so if you're out there and you're thinking you're not smart enough, you are, if you have persistence. Because you think about even what Jeff just said, like, get himself out of bed, you know, and Lena said, year 3, I never want to do this again. And so, like, you get to that period of time and you need to be the one who actually keeps going. So that's one thing. As far as, like, what do we do that's not teaching? Well, and one thing about teaching is teaching takes like 5 times longer than being a student. So if you think it's easy to be the teacher, it's not. Tests take, you know, orders of magnitude longer to make than to study for. And so what we do when we're not teaching mostly is work with PhD students. And so as a professor, like right now I have 5 students, sometimes I've had it up to 10, and I view them almost like my own, another set of children. I have children, but it's another set of children, and you work really intimately with them. And yeah, I guess Jeff also said about not being able to write. And so, like, all students start out not being able to write. And so, you know, you're really working with them on their papers and trying to get the message out. Like, what is this paper actually about? Because it's not saying anything. And, you know, working with them, massaging the paper, getting the message out, reviewing research plans, you know, really, you know, us helping the students to be successful, that's our job, and then to send them on their way. But it's very time consuming. So, you know, when people hear you teach 3 hours a week, like, what? Yeah, we're busy.
Yeah, and another component of being busy, maybe Cynthia, you could speak to it a bit, is it was mentioned in the previous panel that students are funded on grants and things like that, and grant writing and is another dimension of this.
Mm-hmm.
What is that process like, and what's an expected success rate on writing a grant and receiving funding for your work in writing a grant?
Who do you want to answer that?
Oh, Cynthia, sorry.
Okay.
So I'll answer that last piece first. I don't know what the expected success rate is. I know when I started, I was talking to a more senior faculty member about exactly that question. And he told me that his best success rate, you know, sort of his average is 50% success rate. He's senior and he has lots of money, so I feel like that's a good goal to go for. So the process for writing a grant is, it's different than writing papers, but it's actually, I sort of enjoy it. So it's, you know, in some ways it's similar to, you know, it's a piece of the research process. You have some idea, and then you need to convince other people that it's a good idea. So you have to write a paper, a grant proposal that convinces other people that, you know, this idea that you're going to do is a good idea. And so some pieces overlap with your research. You need some preliminary data. So you're going to do some initial research, develop that preliminary data. Hopefully that it bears out that it is in fact a good idea. If not, you're tweaking your idea and going back and everything, right? So that's the first piece of it before you really do much writing at all. And then once you have that preliminary data and sort of in the process of getting that, you've hopefully, you know, sort of your idea has gelled a little bit more. And then you're writing a paper, a grant proposal paper, and pieces of it are similar to writing research papers, but it needs to tell a story in a way that research papers don't necessarily have to do, or maybe don't do quite as much. It's a little bit more high level. You don't have these, you know, you don't have the technical details of the work because you have not yet done the work, right? So it's a little bit more high level. It's more about a little more storytelling. Why is this an important problem? Why is this, why are you the one that's going to be able to solve this problem? Why should you have the money to go after this problem? That kind of thing. I found that I enjoy it. It's a very different kind of writing. And I think I'm more apt to get stuck writing a grant than writing a paper because it's less concrete, but I find it enjoyable.
Great, thanks. Lori, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? It looks like you were about to jump on that question, or did that cover it?
Yeah, no, I guess, I mean, I agree with Cynthia. I really enjoy it. I think because of, you know, most of our other time is spent with students. So it's kind of like something I'm doing myself. And it's not really myself. Students are involved in, but like it's something that is my creation. And it really forces me to think through a topic. And then, you know, like you start piecing, you submit the grant, and then, you know, someone comes and says, can I do an independent study or whatnot? And you're like, yeah, sure. And like, so you have it ready, you have something ready because you've actually thought through it. So I really do enjoy it as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point of seeing opportunities, and it's where like some of the creativity and in many ways the academic entrepreneurship comes from as a professor, and seeing calls that are sort of big, vague ideas, and then having some exciting idea that you specifically want to go after more intentionally. I might switch gears a little bit. There's a question here from the audience, which is, how can you balance doing industry internships with doing required research for your PhD? And Colin, I might throw this one to you and ask about, you know, how do you balance that, and are there typically overlaps or no?
Yeah, so it's actually a little bit of a funny question for me because I didn't do any internships during my PhD, partially because my advisor kind of wanted me to stick around and supervise undergrads who were interning in the lab, which was a really, really useful experience for me in terms of developing my advising abilities. I will say that now, having met lots of people who have done internships, having hosted interns at Google, and having students of my own, I really do encourage people to do internships. One of the big reasons is that if you have a good intern host, they can kind of be a second advisor and can lend a different perspective to the work that you're doing, can maybe fill in gaps of knowledge, and in some cases, can even be a more effective advisor than your main advisor. Hopefully that'll never be the case for my students, but there was one student in my lab when I was doing my PhD who really got interested in a subject that my PhD advisor was not an expert in. And he ended up kind of having his sort of internship advisor. He did multiple internships with this person, and they kind of became kind of more of his primary advisor. And so I do think that that can be incredibly valuable. And, you know, the main way that this is typically done is over the summer via a summer internship. But I know many students at Google who have done a summer internship and then have finagled a way to sort of split their time between, you know, doing a continuing student researcher role at Google and staying in their PhD. And I think whether you can do that sort of depends on whether the position exists at Google, what the policy of your in some cases, I think that could be a mutually beneficial thing for me. I may have cut out for a second there, so if there's anything that I missed, I can loop back on it. The last piece I'll say is just for me personally, as I maintain this 1 day a week role at Google, what I need to do and what I intentionally do is really try to keep the two streams separate. So today actually was the day where I spend 4 hours at Google, and I close my UNC laptop and I open my Google laptop and answer a bunch of emails and talk to people. And I really do think that the kind of research that you can do in industry can be quite a lot different than the kind of research you can do in academia, and both of them are mutually beneficial and can lead to good papers. So that can work well.
And Lena, I was about to just turn it to you because your experience at IBM research has probably some interesting connections here. So go ahead.
Yeah. So my thoughts on this is that like the research at IBM that at least I was part of or around people was a very more focus on a very practical kind of research, and a lot in our meetings or in decisions on what to work with, you kind of ultimately had to say well, how is this going to benefit, IBM or the product? Or it really had to be a lot more applied kind of research, which I kind of really enjoyed that piece of it. And seeing how a large corporation like this would, have these visionary, really to kind of think of where we need to be in 5 years and kind of steer people to work. So you do have some independence, but also not so much, right? Because you have to be tied to what ultimately your company is working for. The one thing that I'm, so ultimately I went back to academia because my heart was into teaching. So I'm a little bit in a different position here. I do some research, but my focus now is more on computer science education, because that's what I'm doing now. And I want to get better at it. So I have to do research to figure out what works and what doesn't. But the one thing I was missing, was, when I was at IBM, I feel like I was getting what are the hot topics? What should I be working on? What research, and going back to academia for a while, I felt a little bit I was missing that piece of it. I didn't know the direction of where things were going. Currently, I'm part of the capstone team, which is the senior design. So I get to work with 6 to 7 teams on different projects, which kind of keeps my, kind of gets me to work on an interesting project and just dabble my feet in something and then move on to another thing. So I really enjoy that. And one thing that I think it's really different again is that in academia, you're kind of your own boss, right? I mean, in a way you are your own business. You have to market yourself. You have to go out there and, get students to work with you. You have to, so it's that part of it I did not see until more recently, right? Even when I was a PhD student, my advisor was an amazing guy, but we didn't have a lab, right? So nowadays I'm seeing a lot more of these labs where a lot of students are kind of more collaborating and working together. So some of the students in the first panel alluded to that. And I think that's a really nice way to do a PhD, in a more collaborative way that way in the lab with more focus and a lot of other people. So if I were going to do that over, that's one thing I would look for, is more the lab kind of experience. And another thing I wanted to mention is that I didn't actually have a computer science degree coming into this. I have an electrical engineering degree, and it wasn't until the very end that I was but I don't want to do this. I want to do this. And so I had a very kind of rough beginning with a lot of doubting myself, can I do that? And it wasn't until my first few classes and I finally saw the grade that I was I guess I can, but it took a while to figure that out.
That's actually a great segue. This notion of being afraid of pigeonholing into a certain direction, and as you specialize, and maybe you're in a master's program that is concentrated in some area, or if you're in a PhD, you're going very deep in a very narrow direction. So I might turn it to you, Jeff, with a question from the chat, which is, if you do a master's or a PhD that's in a very specific direction, are you overly restricting your future opportunities?
It's a good question. I don't know how well I'll be able to address it, so I'll just throw something out there and see if anybody else wants to follow up on it. I mean, I think you're definitely getting a lot of expertise in a narrow area, so that definitely improves your chances of getting hired for that specific area. I imagine some places are broad-minded enough to realize that a lot of these skills that you get in research are generally useful. And if you get somebody who has learned how to research and learned how to write and learned how to do some of these activities, that's still useful. But yeah, I'm not really sure how much you would pigeonhole yourself, especially if you're looking for more of a research job.
I'll throw something out there, which is that I'm now a professor of computer science, but like Lena, my PhD, my last degree, my PhD was in electrical engineering, and then the degree before that was in music, and the degree before that was in math. So I think, you know, a lot of people realize that these different subjects actually have a lot in common, and not only the skills that I was talking about earlier, which are kind of generic, which is what Jeff was mentioning. But also, you know, if you're in electrical engineering, chances are these days you're probably writing software. And so you certainly can write code. You know, there are a lot of commonalities between signal processing and certain subdisciplines in computer science. And so being able to make these jumps, you kind of have to convince people that you're competent a little more than maybe you would if you just kind of took the straight path, but it is ultimately possible. And, you know, yeah, I do totally think that whenever you do a PhD, at the end of your PhD, you're going to be an expert on a tiny subproblem of a bigger subfield in a bigger field in like a bigger field of study. But that being said, you know, there's just so much in common across all of these subproblems, but also just in terms of the skills that you'll get over the course of the PhD.
Yeah, I'll take a little bit off on what Colin said, because I guess Colin and Lena and I all had a varied path. And so one word of wisdom, so like I was industrial engineering and then business and computer science. And so as a grad student, I was taking like advanced algorithms without ever taking algorithms, and advanced compilers without ever taking compilers. Like every subject, it was the graduate level of a course I had not taken. And everyone else in the class almost completely was a computer science undergrad. So like, they're just like, oh yeah, this is the same book I used 2 years ago when I took the undergrad, you know, and so I developed a mantra because I felt really stupid. And my mantra was, prereqs are for wimps. And I told myself that every day. You guys had to take the undergrad class. I could go straight to the graduate class. That was the only way I could really get through it. And so like, if you're thinking about having an advanced degree in something like, you know, Colin's was really diverse and he made it, you know, so just try to think that it will be harder, like it will be harder, but you can do it. And then as far as pigeonholing yourself, I mean, I'm not sure as much with industry, but I would say with academia that, you know, you are your own boss, like, you know, Lena said, and that, so like my topic now, cybersecurity, has nothing to do with my PhD. So like you can just step in a different, like you can't like jump in, you know, like, because I think Cynthia was saying about part of your proposal, you have to show you have competence. They're not going to give you a you know, funding for something you've never done before. So you have to like, if you want to pivot, then you need to write a workshop paper and then a full paper and like, you know, gradually step yourself into a completely different topic, which is eventually what I did. So from an academic standpoint, you know, no pigeonholing, and as best I could see with that, with industry, same thing, you know, that you'd be able to pivot. I don't think you're pigeonholing. That's my bottom line.
Thanks. Yeah, I completely agree. From you know, some time in industry, when you see the people who are working in industry with PhDs, it's very rare that it's in the exact same direction they were headed in as that process. I think it is very much more about the skills that were mentioned and a way of thinking, a way of coming up with questions and strategies for attacking those questions. Can someone speak towards what it takes to be hired as a professor in computer science. And there are actually, we've got 3 different kinds of professors on this call. So maybe we'll go through the different paths that do exist here at a school like NC State or UNC. And let's start with Cynthia, tenure track. What you just finished the tenure process, so congratulations. What does it look like to be hired and get tenure at a research university?
Well, so getting hired, yeah, I don't know. So I completed my PhD, and I actually wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go into academia or industry. And so when I was graduating, I talked to my advisor, and my advisor gave me this advice of just apply broadly and interview broadly, and the interviews will help you figure out what you want. And that was really good advice. And so that's what I did. And it was during the interview process that I decided that, this is what I want to do. I want to go into academia. But it's like my last year of grad school, and it's not like I was like, oh yes, I'm definitely heading to academia. I really was undecided. And I wouldn't even say academia was like my top choice if I had to rank my choices. But then through the interview process, I realized that it is what I want to do. Okay, but that's not quite answering the question. I think a lot of it is certainly you have to do good research. I will say you have to have some research that's really, really good, that you've presented somewhere and someone has noticed it and taken note of it. And I think one thing that I didn't have was a lot of publications. And that was something that I felt like very stressed about this, that, I'd see other people with just pages and pages of publications, and that's just not what I had. And people will say quality over quantity, and you're like, yeah, but also, you want quantity as well. But in the end, it worked out, right? You need, there's this saying that people will remember you for your best work. You'll be known for your best work. And so it really is true that if your best work is good, and so you can get, someone has noticed you at a conference, and then when they see your application, they say, oh yes, let's interview this person. That counts, right? And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as much, right, that you don't have these pages and pages of publications. It's still something, even when I was going up for tenure, I had the same worry. And Lori was actually like a really great mentor to me. And I had this conversation with her many times. But so I will say that, I think for tenure, for getting your job, and also for tenure, this idea of like sorry about the background screaming, the idea that you'll be remembered for, or, you'll be noticed for your best work really is true. And especially for getting the interviews, all of the interviews that I got, it was because there was someone who saw me give a talk at a conference and liked what they saw, and then saw my application in the pile and said, yes, let's interview this person.
Thanks. In trying to be cognizant of time and get to some questions on masters, I'm going to give the TLDR for the 2 other kinds of professors really quick. So as a teaching assistant professor or a lecturer, you're much more teaching focused. And I think that actually looks a lot more like a traditional job search than the tenure track process that has just a different feel to it that you get a sense of when you go through a PhD. And then a professor of the practice type of position typically requires industry experience and winds up having slightly different responsibilities that are maybe focused on like in Jeff's case, the app lab ventures that are not just teaching and have connections to industry. So I might just transition to thinking about some questions about master's programs. We've been talking a lot about PhD programs, and I might turn it to Lena to talk a little bit about what kinds of opportunities does a master's degree open up that you might not have access to from just an undergraduate degree?
Yeah, so when students personally have asked me, so I do recommend. I think there is value in a master's degree. You certainly can become more knowledgeable in a specific area and field, right? So there are some classes you have to take, but you start to do these electives that kind of like really focus and specialize you. into what you want to learn. So it's a completely different feel. And then it's definitely a stepping stone and like on a higher pay scale, right? Like it's sort of like you put the effort into it. And, you know, especially I know for our students at NC State, like I feel like NC State is a little bit of a gateway. You get your master's and you go to the West Coast and you make, you know, you get one of those jobs at Amazon or, you know, Netflix or whatever on the West Coast. So, you know, it's a much less time of commitment. It's really becoming like a computer professional, right? Like you just get more specialized in what you're doing. And like I said, the PhD is more like a scientist, right? Where you have to be way more committed. It's a massive time commitment. You have to be kind of sure that that's how you want to spend your time. And so I think that's very different. There's these new, and Lori, maybe you could add more to that because I don't know all the details, but there's this one, like right as an undergrad, you could go into one extra year and get your master's. I'm like, anybody that can do that, I'm like, you should go for it, right? Because it's, I feel like a very nice way to really kind of prepare yourself better, you know, and differentiate yourself as you, you know, as you start looking for a job. Really opens you to a lot different kinds of opportunities and jobs.
Yeah, just, I mean, you know, we do have a 5-year BS MBA, or not MBA, BS MS program. I'm not sure if does UNC have the same? Yeah. Yeah, so if you're thinking that far ahead, it's a good thing to do because, like, you know, there are alterations to the courses that you take so that you can finish in 5 years. But if you have that foresight, that's a great thing.
Yeah, and I think there are also opportunities, and I'm curious if this is a possible NC State as well, but you are a grad student in your 5th year, and so there are RA and TA positions that can be available to you to help fund that. So it's not a master's that you're going into debt for. The pay is similar to what you heard the previous panel talk about. But it's that's a very compelling opportunity. Is it true at NC State as well that you all take on some RAs out of the 5th year, or not too common?
Not too common.
Sure.
We have a lot of PhD students, so
Yeah.
it's sort of rare that master's students get funded. They might be TAs, but that would be an hourly situation. Some
Sure.
at no tuition.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that's another question that was from the applicant or the registration was, does anyone have any opinion on whether you think industry would treat a 5th year master's degree differently than a master's degree? And I'm seeing a bunch of shaking the head no, and I don't think that's the case either, because they're degrees all the same, and if you were to go back to UNC, you're completing the same set of requirements that we had that you would otherwise for a master's. Let's see. So we've only got a few minutes left, and I think it might be interesting to close with any advice that you feel like someone who is on the fence about academia versus industry, in maybe when you were at that critical juncture, is there anything that you would tell yourself if you're navigating this decision? And I might start with Colin here, because you're split down the middle. You're still one foot in each side.
Yeah, I think one thing that is true of my experience that maybe is not super common knowledge is that there are some places in an industry where the work that you do and the stuff that you publish is really pretty much indistinguishable from the stuff that you might be publishing in academia. And those places do exist, and I don't know what they're like in other fields or in other subfields of computer science, but they're really great places to work. And I think when I was deciding what to do after finishing my PhD, I sort of struggled a lot to decide if I wanted to just do the standard academic track and do a postdoc, or if I wanted to try to spend some time at one of these industrial labs. And I'm really glad I did, and I'm really glad that I also transitioned back to academia. But they can be, if you find the right fit and you want to be a researcher and an academic, you can still do that in industry. So there's not so much of a dichotomy necessarily.
Anyone else want to jump on? Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I would say too. I mean, I relate, I think, a lot better to people who are interested in like software engineering jobs than scientists and researchers. I'm less of a researcher, more of a coder and software engineer. And I think the best thing I could say to people who are on the fence is like, if you're one of these people who enjoys, on the whole, enjoys taking computer science classes, get your master's, right? Especially if you can get it in a funded way. I know for me, I was always like, yes, I get to take new classes next semester. I'm looking forward to this so much. And first week of class, I'm like, oh, look at all the stuff I'm going to learn. This is going to be great. You know, if you relate to that at all, master's is a continuation of all the fun that you've had and even getting to go a little bit deeper. It'll give you more skills, sharpen your thinking in terms of your just computer science knowledge. And especially if you can get it in a funded way, like take on a TA-ship or something like that, do it. Yeah, do it.
And I guess what I'll just add to that is that in a lot of ways, you just keep your options open, and every day you're smarter about what you want to do than you were the day before. And so if you went into a master's program, at least 2 semesters, you're taking the classes. And then eventually you have to decide, do you want to take all classes or do you want to do a thesis? And so you don't need to decide that in your first semester. You might start really thinking about it in your second semester, but by the third. And then if you do that, then you still have your options open for a PhD. And then as you go into your PhD, you still have all your options open. And like Cynthia said, she didn't even know until she was going through her interview process. So, and then once you're in industry, then it goes back to what Colin said, or industry, academia, like you still can switch back and forth. The only thing to watch out for is if you get into an industrial job where publishing is not a possibility because you're working 60 hours a week and they don't care about publications. The only way to come back to academia is if you continue to publish. It's quite easy to go from academia to industry. So for the most part, your options just never stop being open.
Great, thanks. Lena, I saw you had turned off your mic for a second. Did you want to close us out with some parting wisdom?
Sorry, I was on Discord and there was stuff going on there. I was like, where am I hearing stuff? Okay. One thing I wanted to say is that you don't have to plan out the rest of your life. For me, it never worked that way. I sort of was like, well, I'm going to do this. And now it's going to, it just sort of like, but, I have to say like a little bit follow my heart, right? Like, I was like, well, if you follow your heart and you do your research and, like, for example, before going into grad school, I did work for about 6 or 8 months. I kind of had like the job in the cubicle and I did that for a bit. And people were saying, oh, you'll get used to it. And I said, no. And so I went to grad school, and then I was just going to do a master's and, I didn't want to do a PhD. And then I was like, well, wait, so you don't have, I don't think you have to have it all planned out and things just work out. You'll make the right choice for yourself. So I don't think that you need to have a complete plan and just be flexible because, sometimes people just can't wait to get out and be done with college. And that is sometimes like you have, the best times you ever have, right? You have the rest of your life to be outside of college and to be a grown up and to have to do things. And it's much harder. Oh, that's what I wanted to say. I think that for me anyways, I knew that if I didn't get my PhD, it would be much harder for me to come back. Like I felt like once you start getting, life gets complicated, I have kids too, and it would be very hard for me, I think, to make that pivot right now. So, just think about that, right? Like life gets more complicated. And if I give myself one more advice would be to do more internships. I didn't want to go and be away from home. And if I could give myself one advice, would be like, go away for 2 months, right? Go experience different things because this is the time, well, not with the pandemic, but in general, right? Like this is the time to try out things and to see where your heart is. And I've never made choices based on money, I've always been like, this is, kind of what I want to do. So.
Yeah, and I did get a PhD with 3 kids from start to end. Wouldn't recommend it, but it's possible.
Great. Well, I believe we've gone a few minutes over here, but I want to thank our panelists. This was a fantastic discussion. And I want to say that we will, as Rosario just posted in Discord, there will be continued conversation. I know there are questions we didn't get to, so come ask those questions in Discord, and we should be able to have some more direct conversations with the audience. But thank you all for being here tonight.